Well, joining me now with no doubt a very different view on Iran is Virginia's Democratic Senator Tim Kaine. He sits on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Armed Services Committee, and he was also Hillary Clinton's running mate in the 2016 election. And he's joining me now from Capitol Hill. Senator Kaine, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Christian. Good to be with you on an important topic.
Well, I just wanted to get your reaction. You heard Senator Cotton, who basically is attributing the attacks on tankers in the Gulf to Iran, although Iran's denied it. And you've seen what we've been describing as the sort of ratcheting up of the American rhetoric and movements. How are you reading all of this?
Well, Christian, I wrote a piece in The Atlantic in July of 2018 when President Trump ignored the advice of Secretaries Tillerson, Mattis, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Joe Dunford, our allies, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and pulled out of a diplomatic deal that was curbing Iran's nuclear program. I wrote a piece said the president is in danger of blundering us into a war with Iran, and I believe that very deeply. The pulling out of the deal, the designation of part of the Iranian government as a terrorist organization, the ratcheting up of sanctions, the bellicose explanation for things that are somewhat routine, like the deployment of the USS Lincoln and a whole series of other things. I think this president, by casting aside diplomacy, is raising the risk of unnecessary war. And now we see reports that they're contemplating 120,000 troops into the region. I represent a very profoundly pro-military state. I've got a child in the Marine Corps. I will tell you it would be idiocy for the United States to get involved in another war in the Middle East right now, and especially it would be wrong if the president were to try to start or initiate it on his own without coming to Congress. If he can't convince Congress, that should tell you something. It's not in the national interest, but he's showing every sign that what he wants to do is act unilaterally, to the point of not even giving us briefings yet about this intel that they're bandying about from the White House.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that intel, but first let me just repeat to you your own tweet. Donald Trump is taking steps that I fear are leading us to an unnecessary war with Iran. That chills my blood. Let me be clear, I am going to do anything I can to stop him from sidestepping Congress to start an illegal war. What can you do?
Well, there are a number of things that we can do. For example, we're working on the defense authorizing bill right now. We might be able to take steps in there to put up some guardrails so that the president can act unilaterally. And second, we always have the option, as we showed recently with respect to the president's putting American support behind the Saudi prosecution of their interest in the Yemeni civil war. We have the opportunity to put a motion on the floor to force the United States to withdraw from hostilities. That is guaranteed a debate and vote where everybody gets to go on the record and declare whether or not they are for this war or not. And if the president tries to get us into hostilities without Congress, you can be sure we will have that debate and vote in the floor of the Senate and the House, and that's the way it should happen.
You heard Senator Cotton say that you guys in the Senate, particularly on the Intelligence Committee, but I'm sure on some of your committees as well, that the intelligence is there, and if we knew what you all knew, then we'd understand how serious the threat is. And yet, I played him the soundbite from the general there, the British general who's deputy anti-ISIS commander, who says they have seen no step up in threats, or they have no evidence on the ground there that Iran or its proxies are stepping up their threats to American personnel.
And Christian, we have heard that, and we're also hearing grave concerns expressed about the intelligence, even from members of the administration. So here's what I will say about it. The White House hasn't yet really briefed us. It's unusual to order all personnel to leave Iraq, non-essential personnel. Normally, an administration would come up and brief armed services and foreign relations. We're going to have to take this step, and here's why they haven't done that. I have heard that a small group of leaders and ranking members of committees might get a briefing this afternoon, and that the full Senate might get a briefing next week. But we're very late in this process for us to still be waiting for briefings. So when we do get the briefings, there are going to be two questions. One, what is your level of intel about elevated risk of danger from Iran? And second, if there is such an elevated risk, is that activity initiated by Iran, or can it be explained by Iran being provoked by the United States? It was the U.S. that withdrew from the diplomatic deal. It's the U.S. that's imposing sanctions. It's U.S. leaders that are talking about regime change in Iran. It's the U.S. that's talking about how many troops we need to put into their neighborhood, not their troops into our neighborhood. So part of the question that we have to ask when we finally get the briefing we should have gotten weeks ago is whether an elevated threat level is attributable to Iran being provoked by the United States.
What do you make of what Senator Cotton said, that President might not need an extra vote or extra permission from Congress because he has been able to, continue the activity in Syria that was started, obviously, by President Obama, the anti-ISIS activity, and conduct what he considers, appropriate military intervention under current existing approvals?
That position by Senator Cotton, look, I respect Senator Cotton as a public servant in many ways, but his suggestion that the president should be able to take us to war with Iran without a congressional vote should frighten anybody, especially people who have taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution. The Constitution says it's Congress that makes the decision to declare war. And, Christian, why does the Constitution say that? This is one of the clearest parts of the Constitution, and it was put into the Constitution because of a realization that executives will often overreach in getting into war, and that what you need to have, if you're going to order troops into harm's way, is a public discussion about what's at stake. And if, after that discussion, the Article I branch votes on it and says it is in the national interest, we need to do that, that is the green light to suggest, okay, we're going to order our troops into harm's way. But for a president to say, well, I can do this without Congress, betrays a lack of confidence that he can convince Congress. For a member of Congress to say, Mr. President, do it without us, that often displays a lack of backbone. I don't want to have a debate and be forced to vote on it. I would love to have Tom Cotton stand on the floor of the Senate and make his case for why he thought war was a good idea, and make his case for why he thought war against Iran would be easy. And I'd like to stand up on the floor and say war would be a bad idea, and the suggestion that it's easy is wrong. And then let's have that debate not on CNN. Let's have the debate on the floor of the United States Senate and in the House. And if I lose, if there are the votes there that suggest war is a good idea, then the president has legal authority. But trying to bypass the debate and the vote is very, very troubling.
Do you think, why do you think this is happening? Why do you think all these things we've just been seeing, what you just correctly called a routine deployment that's being dressed up as a particular deployment of the aircraft carrier and the strike force, and this unusual announcement about non-essential staff, and whether it's correct or not, the president said it wasn't correct, but the New York Times saying that there's a plan from John Bolton to send 120,000 troops. What do you think they are really trying to do? Because Iran thinks they're trying to provoke them into some kind of reaction and use that as a casus belli.
Well, and I deeply worry about the same thing. Why is this happening now? There's probably a number of reasons, Christian, but here would be one. The president had a Secretary of Defense, Mad Dog Mattis, who was a hawk on Iran. But he told the president, as Secretary of Defense, the Iran deal is working on the nuclear portfolio, not everything, and it serves America's national interest. And we also had a Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who had the same position, and we had a National Security Advisor, General McMaster, who had the same position. Now we have a Secretary of State in Mike Pompeo who has a long track record as a member of Congress in talking about the need for regime change in Iran. When the nuclear deal was on the table, he said, look, we could wipe out their nuclear weapons arsenal with 2,000 airstrikes, suggesting that we should use military action as a preferable option to diplomacy. So we now have in John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, somebody who has a long track record of talking about regime change and the need for military action against Iran. We have a Secretary of State who is in the same philosophical camp. And we have a Secretary of Defense, acting Secretary of Defense, who does not have the gravitas or the experience of General Mattis, who hasn't particularly weighed in on this. So I view this as a fundamental change, because what I considered the really smart national security members of the president's team, who could look at this situation and say, a war in Iran right now would be idiocy. We should stay in the nuclear deal. They've all been fired. They've been replaced with people who have years-long records of talking tough. And I think that's why this president, who said we should be out of wars in the Middle East, who said the Iraq war was a horrible idea, that's why he and others are now moving closer and closer to it. Maybe it's bluff talk, but I can tell you this: when the military families in Virginia, whose sons and daughters have been deployed many times over the last 18 or 19 years, hear the president talking, or his team talking about 120,000 troops, or maybe we'll put in more than that, it is psychologically terrorizing to them to hear that kind of language thrown around loosely.
Mm-hmm. And I can see you getting very, very concerned about this. And I wonder whether you think, even if this rhetoric and these troop movements and diplomatic personnel movements, even if that was a continuation of their doctrine of maximum pressure against Iran, do you think that it will work as a bluff, and it will work to get Iran to somehow come back to the table to get a better deal? And let me just, while you're thinking about that, play you what Iran says about this tactic.
The policy of maximum pressure and the offer of a dialogue are mutually exclusive. They cannot expect Iran to accept an offer under pressure, while the policy of maximum pressure is creating problems for the Iranian people. We cannot accept a dialogue based on coercion, based on intimidation and threats.
I mean, how do you react to that? That's Iran's ambassador to the United Nations.
Well, I think that there is, look, Iran's doing a lot of bad things that we need to counter. We just shouldn't have reopened the door to allow them to go back to enriching uranium when we were effectively limiting it. Here's what I think about this: the past is prologue. So let's look at the situation in Iran back in 2011. One of the best speeches about Iran that I ever heard given was given by Bibi Netanyahu at the United Nations, and I believe it was in 2011. And Christiane, it was the famous speech where Bibi drew the bomb.
Yep.
It was kind of the Wile E. Coyote bomb, and that got a lot of attention. What got less attention is something very wise that he said in the speech. He said he thanked the assembly members for joining together in the sanctions campaign against Iran. But he said, but we have to be honest, the sanctions campaign has hurt Iran's economy, but it hasn't slowed down their nuclear program. In fact, in some ways, it may have accelerated it. And he was right about that. This is often the case in one-on-one relations and in international relations. If you go hard at somebody and you put on pressure, there is a great tendency of somebody to then stiffen their back and resist. And so in the earlier iteration, the maximum pressure campaign did hurt Iran's economy, and that ultimately led to a reason for dialogue, but it accelerated their nuclear program. Mm-hmm. So if that's what happened in the past, then the U.S. scrapping a deal that they were complying with, they had to limit uranium down to a sub-weapons level. They had to get rid of much of the tonnage of uranium they had. They had to give up on plutonium production. They had to allow intrusive inspections that they weren't allowing before. These were requirements that went for 10, 15, 25 years, and the agreement to inspections were permanent. They had to do all that they weren't doing before, and it was the U.S. that tore that up. So I tend to agree, if you want dialogue, then don't blow up dialogue. And don't blow up a diplomatic deal and then think returning to pressure will get you a deal. Furthermore, think about the broader effect, Christiane, on North Korea. The president is trying to find a deal with North Korea. If he gets one that's a third the deal that President Obama got with Iran, he would tout it as Nobel Prize worthy. But if the U.S. was willing to tear up a deal with Iran that was working, what incentive does that give North Korea to enter into a deal with the United States? And I made this argument in July of 2018. I said, if you walk out of the deal with Iran, you're not only going to return us to an arms race in the Middle East, where nations like Saudi Arabia will start trying to get nuclear technology, which they are, possibly creating missile programs, which they apparently are. You're not only going to create an arms race in the Middle East, you are also going to make it harder to get a deal with North Korea. And you see what's happened. Despite 2 summits, North Korea has not taken a single step toward denuclearization. And you have to wonder whether part of the reason is their belief that a deal with the United States would be torn up by the United States.
It really is a grave, grave moment. Senator Kaine, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Christiane.